Argentina was lured into a proposal that would ruin his life and career, all because of two individuals born in the neighboring country with a green and yellow flag. His final destination would be the war in Ukraine, where he would face special forces firing RPGs at his positions. There, he would see people of other nationalities suffering the same fate, being hunted by drones or crawling alongside the bodies of their fallen comrades. Juan Bettiga was going through a difficult time in his life when suddenly his son started communicating less and less. The young man's name was Gianni Bettiga, someone described by his mother as a boy who never liked to follow any rules. During those sad times, Juan wondered how to help his son. But the challenge would be great because the young Argentine was on the Ukrainian front, apparently in one of the hottest areas on the continent. The worst part was that Juan's own life depended on his son's life. It's an increasingly dramatic story of a young man who went to witness hell in Ukraine. It was easy for the Argentine to understand what could happen to his son. He had heard news of almost 36 Brazilians who had died fighting for Ukraine. Many foreigners also fought on the Russian side during the war. Ukrainian drones caught them in the trenches, their looks of regret clear in front of the cameras. Explosives were prepared to eliminate them. There was no mercy for these soldiers who had come from far away for different reasons. For the meat grinder of Donbass. When the drones started buzzing surrounding their victim, there wasn't a single person who didn't wish to be back in their homeland. The soldier's heart raced, thinking about the choices that led him to pick up the Makarov and face that threat. Because of money and a Russian citizenship. And suddenly, none of those choices mattered anymore. Amid smoke and burned flesh on the field, one story ended as many others began. The offer brought the Nepali, Sua, Africans, Cubans, and even Brazilians to fight on the Russian side, filling their ranks, to the point of bothering some governments that had to respond to desperate requests from families. The young Argentine would also join them. Gianni was 23 years old when he decided to leave his homeland where he lived with his father. He departed Ushuaia, southern Argentina, in 2025. Located at the southern tip of South America, right in the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, this Argentine city is famous for being considered the gateway to the so-called end of the world. There he attended elementary and high school at a Salesian school, and according to his father, he never touched a weapon. He didn't even like paintball, but an idea started to grow in his mind. He wanted to go to Russia. He was drawn to the cold climate of Uksaya, the Orthodox tradition, and the chance to live a unique experience. He arrived in Russia in February 2025 with a student visa that would only expire at the end of the year. His study trip took him to Yekaterinburg. With approximately 1.4 million inhabitants, Yekaterinburg is the fourth most populous city in Russia, behind only Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Novosibirsk. The city gained historical notoriety for being the site of the death of the Romanov family, executed in the former Ipatiev house during the Russian Civil War. In the place where the residence once stood, the Church on the Blood was later built, constructed in honor of the Romanovs after their canonization by the Russian Orthodox Church. In addition, it is home to important centers of knowledge, including the Federal University of the Urals, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and a wide variety of institutes dedicated to research and academic training. It seemed like the ideal place for the young man who wanted to learn languages and study international relations and foreign trade at the university. It was located far from the front, without major strategic targets for Ukrainian drones, which had recently been hitting oil and gas facilities in Russia. Although Ukrainian attacks avoided civilians, there was still the risk of an inaccurate shot or fragments from interceptions injuring innocent people. In the interior of the country, however, Gianni knew and longed for a different side of the war. There, the news only boasted about the glories and successes of the armed forces. In state propaganda, no Russian died except as a hero, something predictable in a nation where criticizing the army was a crime. The reality, however, was that even in the face of real victories, thousands were perishing on the battlefield. Nothing was said about the desperate soldiers seeking refuge behind dry trees to avoid the fate of the charred corpses around them. The panic only ceased to give way to the moans after the impact of a kamikaze drone. It didn't matter where they tried to hide. The reconnaissance drones found them, sadistically giving them away to the explosive charge that would follow. The dead were left with medals as long as someone confirmed their demise. The survivors were left to crawl without dignity among the bodies of their comrades, longing to reach any place where they could be rescued. Until then, they would feel the cold, blood-soaked earth on their hands and knees, smell the putrid odor of the corpses up close right at nose level. They would see worms consuming the flesh of familiar people who'd been torn apart.
But for Gianni, this news hardly reached inside Russia.
Unless you looked really hard, it seemed like everything was going well. He focused on learning the language and scored 74% on a proficiency exam in July. A second exam was set for November, required for his foreign trade undergraduate enrollment. The problem was the date of the second exam, which coincided with the end of the Argentine's addiction. This started to worry Gianni more and more, until he was approached by recruiters during a museum visit. This is when the story becomes confusing. But apparently there were two Brazilians involved who insisted that the Argentinians sign the contract. It would be good for him. Being part of the armed forces would allow him to receive a monthly salary and obtain a residence permit. The visa problem would be solved. The Brazilians had given him the solution, and he wouldn't even have to try very hard. It was a delicate matter. Brazilians were already fighting on the Russian side. Some were still facing the challenge with courage and commitment, but others had already passed away. There were still those who bore the marks of having been deceived by a pair of compatriots who robbed them after they had signed the contracts. But Gianni might not have known any of this. Poorly advised, he was only able to understand part of what the contract said. He just made it clear that he didn't want to be part of the Russian army. He only wanted a quiet job in the administrative department. The Brazilians advised him, saying that everything would work out. He signed the 2-page contract in Russian. Everything seemed fine. All right, ready for chaos and despair in the Argentine's life. In no time, Gianni was already training in Moscow. It was the first time he had ever handled weapons. He didn't dare tell his family what was happening, and the messages became more and more sparse. There he met people of other nationalities and, little by little, began to realize that training with rifles was not for an administrative position. He spent 2 weeks living with South Africans, Senegalese, Indians, and Cubans. They were all foreigners who had ended up there, some knowing they were going to fight, others repeating the same story as Gianni. Maybe the Cubans couldn't claim the same as the Argentine, or at least not all of them. According to the Internal Department of the United States Department of State, as shared with the Reuters agency. It was estimated that up to 5,000 Cuban fighters were fighting in the invasion of Ukraine alongside Russia. The document stated that the Caribbean country would be, right after North Korea, the largest supplier of foreign troops for the Russian offensive. With an estimated force of 1,000 to 5,000 men, there were even accusations that the Cuban government was aware of this and that. Just as it exported doctors, it also exported soldiers. The main motivation was definitely financial. Leaked documents indicated that a Cuban could multiply his income exorbitantly by almost 18,600%, jumping from an annual salary of about $160 to something close to $30,000. Gianni left the training after 2 weeks. By the third week, with an automat Kalashnikova in his hands, he was already on the front line somewhere in Donetsk. He hadn't talked to his parents about it yet, but they already suspected that something was very wrong. The video calls had stopped and messages were no longer received right away. Later, he would mention the 57th Battalion, which might have referred to the 57th Independent Motorized Infantry Brigade of the Guard. That unit was fighting on two fronts in Ukraine. One of them was in the south, where their drones were chasing Ukrainian soldiers along the Velika-Novozilka axis. After the fall of Volodar in November 2024, the Russians maintained a steady line of advance, although it was by no means easy. Their armored vehicles tried to reach the villages while coming under Ukrainian artillery fire. Drones swooped down, targeting the transports, while soldiers squeezed together, praying in various languages that nothing would hit them. Some people were there thinking they would only be digging trenches, but now they faced the possibility of a drone putting a hole in their body. They disembarked and spread out among the destroyed houses, following orders to clear the territory. The same thing was happening along the tree lines. An armored vehicle needed to cross the field, taking advantage of the distraction of the Ukrainian drone pilots. The BMP's cannon fire lashed the trees, leaving the Ukrainians vulnerable, unable to attack the enemy who was approaching dangerously. Each shot from the armored vehicle detonated near the trench. The defenders crouched down, trying to escape the explosions and the shrapnel. When the vehicle stopped, the Russians jumped out with their rifles pointed at the woods, quickly infiltrating among the trees. While the suppressive fire continued, the transport left, letting the fight go on. The 57th Brigade's raids became increasingly frequent in that region, taking advantage of the shortage of Ukrainian infantry. Drones weren't always in the sky to protect the defenders, so the Russians infiltrated the forest more and more. Their rifles fired at the trenches, knowing that often they would be fighting against 3 or 4 defenders in each position. The attack risk was high, but they saw few drones in the air. The Russians soon sent reinforcements to intensify the assault. Explosions felled trees while gunfire targeted men. The Russians continued their assaults, throwing grenades whenever there was any suspicion of life in the trenches. With each position they took, they got closer to another village. Thus, flags were being raised in the southern region of Donetsk and on the border with Zaporizhia. There were many flags being raised. It seemed that amid so many victories, there was only happiness among the Russian armed forces. With each village that fell, drones filmed the men with smiles on their faces, displaying the 3 colors of their country. Of course, no Russian corpses appeared in the footage. It wasn't good for propaganda, much less for the brainwashed fools to understand the cost of war and how many died so that a village of 100 or 1,000 inhabitants could be taken. Odradny had fewer than 100 inhabitants, and Voskresenka barely had 500 residents before the invasion. Even Velika-Novozilka, one of the local strongholds, was a town of just over 5,000 inhabitants. Obviously, it was important for the Russians to have their victories, but often more soldiers were lost in these battles than the number of inhabitants in these villages. Gianni understood this very early on. The drones of Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade launched themselves against the Russians, who were shattered by the impact, incinerating men who hadn't even disembarked yet. Sometimes one or another managed to escape, but the kamikazes were in the sky waiting to exact Ukrainian revenge on Moscow's soldiers. Even those who sought shelter in village houses had their bones and flesh crushed by the explosions, and their moans gradually faded away under the rubble. Bomber drones watched over the buildings. Some of these deadly instruments were heavy, capable of carrying multiple explosives, dropped on Putin's contractors. Each drop meant death or permanent injury. Sometimes, heavy drones like Bettiga carried a payload so powerful it could detonate a war tank. When it hit the houses, the shockwave broke through roofs and spread in all directions, knocking down walls and throwing the bears to the ground. Gianni learned how seductive propaganda could be, but reality was different. Among videos of successful raids, there were hidden images of long mechanized columns being repeatedly struck by drones and artillery. Smoke engulfed the armored vehicles at the front while fire licked the soldiers' uniforms. Gradually, steel carcasses filled the road, stopping the advance. Those who came behind following orders ended up meeting the same fate. What Russian propaganda ignored, Ukrainian propaganda used. Desperate soldiers felt the heat of the explosion, being thrown through the air until they landed with limbs attached to their bodies only by shreds of muscle and broken bones. The Ukrainian Air Force didn't have even a fraction of the power of their planes. They were still able to deliver bombs to the positions of the 57th Brigade. Soldiers were blown up in newly captured trenches without time to celebrate the advance. In the midst of all this was Gianni, writing to his father with frightened words. The father read the message on his cell phone.
Good morning, Dad. I'm on the front line. They sent us an hour after that last message I sent you. I want to go back to Argentina, no matter what happens. I'm no longer interested in this country. Please, do something to get me out of here. I love you, Dad. Daddy, don't. I'm scared of dying because it happens instantly, but I'm even more afraid of losing an arm or a leg.
That chilled Juan Bettiga's spirit, making him desperate when he found out where his son was. The trenches were nothing like in the Russian training. He slept among rats, smelling the stench of the trench and hearing people speaking in other languages about the situation they were living in. Some were resigned, others complained and desperately wanted to return to their country. The situation on the front line was tense. There were even Ukrainian special forces trying to stop the relentless advance of the 57th Russian Brigade. These operators moved through the trenches, readying their weapons to bombard the advancing Russians among the trees. Rocket-propelled grenade, 7 shots were part of the arsenal, propelling grenades up to 500 meters. The wave of destruction was brief, but it generated enough shrapnel to injure anyone nearby. The PSRL-1, an American copy of the rocket-propelled grenade 7, was also in the arsenal of the American Special Forces. They were using whatever was necessary to try to blow up the Russians. Stopping that advance was not easy at all. The soldiers pulled the trigger, saw the ammunition fly, and got ready for even more to keep pounding the Russians. It wasn't easy for the Ukrainians to try to stop that advance. The Russian bombardments were terrible and never stopped, and at night the explosions swept across the battlefield, relentlessly seeking Ukrainian lives. The scene turned into wreckage as the 57th Brigade advanced. They acted quickly, ignoring the cost. On corpses along the way, their drones dropped grenades into the woods where the defenders hid. The survivors had to retreat. There was little infantry left to maintain resistance in those places in the face of such brutal attacks. Columns of smoke rose among the trees, leaving the vegetation destroyed and knocking down trunks that covered corpses and wounded men. The rockets from the launchers, multiple with the grid, fell with little accuracy, but each impact was an explosion that, if it didn't kill, shook the spirit of the few men who defended the tree line. The small Russian birds also flew over the fields to hunt soldiers. It was an individualized attack, practically guided, as if the target's name was written in the Book of the Dead. So many detonations pushed the defenses back, forcing part of the Ukrainian troops to retreat from those positions, giving more and more ground to the Russians. Gianni spent his free time watching war movies sent by his father. His mind was immersed in horror, and even in moments of calm, that was what attracted him. But it wasn't because he was falling in love with the glory of war. It was more like a wound in his mind that he kept scratching and wouldn't let heal. At that time, he sent a message to the father.
There was
Truth in that, as the Iraqis who were fighting said.
Many brothers died. No, it's bad there, damn. You keep living, storm and infantry, and everything is bad there. Yes, my friend, he signed a contract and then...
During an advance, Gianni went through hell when the armored vehicles started exploding under attack from Ukrainian drones. The vehicles held out for a few moments, but the birds came in relentless succession, destroying the defenses until they completely immobilized the Russian convoy. In these assaults, the Russians used all kinds of vehicles, including motorcycles, in an attempt to saturate the number of targets and allow some to escape. The less fortunate ones encountered the kamikazes in the middle of the charge, being violently thrown by the combined force of the motorcycle's speed and the devastating impact of the explosion. The remaining armored vehicles still tried to move, but what the drones didn't destroy was stopped by anti-tank mines. In the aftermath of the attack, Gianni had to hide inside one of the destroyed wrecks. He was lucky that the bombing stopped. Normally, the Ukrainians hunted down every survivor who tried to hide. Bomber drones swept the battlefield, searching for desperate men after the failed attack. Explosions inside an armored vehicle exponentially increased the lethality, and the drone operators knew that. The explosive needed to go through a crack. Inside, the shockwave was contained by the metal, concentrating all the energy on the fragile human flesh. The pressure would crush, smash organs, twist bones, shrapnel would ricochet, piercing the body multiple times. The soldier survived only for moments, with the concussion clouding his thoughts while blood dripped, marking his final moments like an hourglass in the Reaper's hand. Sometimes it was hard to get a grenade through the openings, but when a kamikaze drone managed to fly with surgical precision into the vehicle, the explosion turned the BMP into a tomb of smoke. After 6 hours of attack, Gianni's squad managed to escape to the surrounding trees, where they waited in the darkness for rescue. The Argentines' days of fighting were brutal. It was a time of pure suffering. Although Gianni didn't make it clear where he was, he warned about the difficulties. And since his group's advances were arduous, there was a possibility he was fighting in another sector. There were members of the 57th Motorized Rifle Brigade near Pokrovsk too. Although less likely, the fighting in that region was just as intense, with reports of foreigners trying to survive the waves of attacks against the city. Anyway, even though the Argentine tried to quit, the Russians denied his departure until the contract ended. Meanwhile, the father was fighting his own battles, both for his life and for his sons. Juan Bettiga, Gianni's father, was diagnosed with stage 1 liver cancer. In an act of paternal sacrifice, he made the decision to postpone his own treatment to focus all his energy on bringing his son back home. The situation was even more critical because Gianni was a 100% match for organ or blood donation, making his presence in Argentina not just an emotional desire, but a potential necessity for his father's survival. Juan appealed to the Russian Minister of Defense and the Russian and Argentine embassies to secure the release of his son. But the responses were slow and inconclusive. The political mobilization in Argentina, including the support of a senator and the governor of Tierra del Fuego, aimed to increase the pressure for a solution. In the midst of so many suffering in a war, Gianni was lucky to still be alive. Death was the only reward for so many who had joined the conflict, whether they knew or not what deadly chaos they had gotten into. War toys with the dreams and ambitions of human beings and ignores excuses and pleas when the bombs start to fall, preferring to listen to the symphony of explosions and final prayers.